So Cooper lasted just 15 games in charge at Leicester, winning only 3 of those games with 5 draws and 7 defeats. You can see here how Cooper compares to the club's last 5 bosses. His win percentage of 16.67 is the lowest of the lot. Well, Cooper leaves newly promoted Leicester 2 points and 2 places outside the bottom 3. They have 10 points from their 12 games. Southampton, Ipswich and Crystal Palace currently in the relegation places.
A little bit surprised, but, you know, at the end of the day, it's all about results. We know that it was a poor performance yesterday, but I feel sorry for Steve Cooper in a sense. I don't believe he's doing much wrong. It was a very difficult challenge. I think that, you know, 1 or 2 defeats and the fans are always going to kind of be on his back a little bit with that connection. You know, I believe whoever comes in, it's going to be difficult. It's a challenge, this is, for Leicester this year. But obviously, sorry to see him go. And we've got to look forward again. You know, the owners have been right every time they've kind of, you know, got a new manager in. So hopefully, you know, we can appoint the right man. We'll see.
Well, let's now get to our reporter, Danyal Khan, who has been covering Leicester for us this season. We can cross live to him now. Daniel, a very good evening to you. You're at the final game of Cooper's reign yesterday. What do you make of the timing of this announcement?
Yeah, good evening, Jasper. I mean, I think many of us are probably surprised that it came after that defeat to Chelsea. Probably not a game Leicester were expected to win at home. Chelsea were very good in that game for large parts. But I think, in a way, it summed up Leicester's season because it was down, even though Chelsea dominated that game. They went in at half-time 1-0 up, and that goal came from another individual mistake at the back. It was without fouls on that occasion, but I think that sums up Leicester's season so far. You mentioned the 5 draws in the Premier League, and I think the club, Leicester, have made this decision thinking that perhaps they could be on a higher points total than where they are in 16th at the moment, 10 points from 12 games. But for Steve Cooper, he's had a pretty difficult task when he took charge in the summer after Leicester achieved promotion with Enzo Maresca playing a very particular way of football. We've seen with other sides in recent years, whether that was Burnley last season, Southampton this season, doesn't necessarily guarantee results. So I think Steve Cooper's spoken to us in the media, but also to his players about trying to adapt that style slightly to what he knows worked at his previous club, Nottingham Forest, in the Premier League when he kept them in this league. And I think that perhaps is where a slight disconnect started forming. I think the fans hadn't particularly taken to Cooper, and I think he would acknowledge that as well from the very start of the season, as Steve Walsh mentioned, whether that had to do with his Forest connection. I think the style of play and the mistakes that the players had made probably led to that as well. But I mentioned the fans. I think this style of play Steve Cooper was trying to implement this season, I think the players just weren't getting quite on board with it, and there seemed to be a disconnect there as well, which I think in terms of the club, they decided to make this decision because they want to stay in the Premier League. And if you remember a few years ago under Brendan Rodgers, it took them till April to make the decision to part ways in a bid to stay in the league. They weren't successful on that occasion, and while they're out of the relegation zone, they've made the decision now and to act swiftly in the hope that they can stay in the Premier League this season.
Yeah, what do you think that process looks like, Dan? Then who will be making that decision and what will be the key considerations?
Yeah, it'll be very interesting in terms of they've had 2 very differing managers, Jasper, in terms of Enzo Maresca to Steve Cooper, and clearly 2 managers who play a certain style of football, play in an attacking style of football. In terms of who'll be making those decisions, it'll come down to predominantly 2 men. The chairman, Kun Top, who had a big role to play in terms of Steve Cooper's appointment, as well as the director of football, John Rudkin. So expect those 2 men to be key in the decision-making of who the next head coach or manager will be at Leicester. Who will that be? Well, 2 names I think that are clearly out there who'll be linked with any vacancy in the Premier League. One is, of course, Ruud van Nistelrooy. We saw what he did at Manchester United in his interim period there. He's well liked by numerous clubs around England, especially in the Premier League, but also I'd have to also say Graham Potter. He's someone who's been linked with Leicester in the past. They've had a long-standing interest in him in the past, so we'll see if perhaps that could be an avenue Leicester try to go down once again. But it'll be very interesting. They mentioned in their statement they'll be working swiftly to make that next appointment, but as you mentioned just before you started chatting to me, Jasper, it's interesting Alan Tate and Steve Rams have always also left the club behind Steve Cooper, with Ben Dawson taking first team training for the foreseeable future.